Beginning all the way back with the primaries, the idea that the Donald could become president of the United States seemed hilarious to many. A spectacle to boost everyone's ratings, to be sure. But now that it's President-elect Donald Trump, that's merely headed off to his inauguration in January. The last laugh is on anyone but him. How much did that smug dismissal of the candidate help galvanize his support? And could it happen here? Has it happened here? Joining us now for their thoughts. In the nation's capital, there's John Ibbitson, writer-at-large for the Globe and Mail. In London, Ontario, Hannah Rasmussen, director at the public policy think tank Projection North. And here in studio, Janice Stein, founding director of the Munk School of Global Affairs at the U of T, Quam McKenzie, CEO of the Wellesley Institute and professor of psychiatry at the U of T, Mark Toohey, author of Mayor Rob Ford, Uncontrollable, which captures much of his time as chief of staff to Toronto's former mayor, and Stephen Marsh, contributing editor at Esquire magazine. I want to thank the cast of Ben-Hur for coming in tonight for this discussion. Here we go. I want to do two things here off the top. First of all, thanks everybody for coming. Second of all, I'm going to read a little chunk of an essay here by the American essayist Emmett Renson that was in Vox earlier this year, and then we're going to see a little clip from The Daily Show, which always has such good stuff to say. There is a smug style in American liberalism. It has been growing these past decades. It is a way of conducting politics predicated on the belief that American life is not divided by moral difference or policy divergence, not really, but by the failure of half the country to know what's good for them. An industry arose to cater to the smug style. It began in humor and culminated for a time in The Daily Show, a program that more than any other thing advanced the idea that liberal orthodoxy was a kind of educated savvy and that its opponents were, before anything else, stupid. The smug liberal found relief in ridiculing them. The internet only made it worse. Let's follow that up with the aforementioned clip from the aforementioned Daily Show during this presidential election season. Roll it.
Donald Trump is calling for extreme vetting, an ideological litmus test for prospective Muslim immigrants to see if they believe in core American values like religious freedom, gender equality, and gay rights. We went to a Trump rally to see if his own supporters could pass the test. Two men getting married is blank.
Disgusting.
Actually, the answer is legal in the United States.
It's legal, but I don't like it.
These extreme nations, they don't treat women with respect.
We treat women with respect here.
Yes, we do.
That's an American ideal.
Yeah.
Tell me about your shirt. What's it say?
It says, Hillary sucks, but not like Monica.
Hilarious. So we were talking about treating women with respect. We don't even see the irony in it. I love it, right? Are you afraid the extremists are already here right now?
They could be anywhere.
They could be right here.
They could be.
Yeah, he could be over there. He could be that guy or this guy. He could be anybody.
It could be anybody.
Okay, that's funny late night TV stuff, but my question, John Ibbitson, get us started, is how much did sanctimonious smugness among progressives contribute to Donald Trump's victory in your view?
It's unmeasurable. I think other things, though, were more powerfully at work. Look, I have only myself to blame for this. I'm one of those who confidently predicted that Hillary Clinton would win the election, even though I wrote an essay back in October that talked about the deep sense of disenfranchisement among people in the Midwestern states, the industrial states who I talked to when I've been traveling down there, and that elites of both the left and the right needed to be aware of this anger, that people had been left behind and they were not, their voices were not being heard. It wasn't ideological, it was just a sense of abandonment. I then proceeded to ignore my own advice, partly because of the polling data that seemed to suggest that Hillary Clinton had won it, and partly because I just at a fundamental level believed that voters almost always do the right thing, because through the course of my life they always have done the right thing. This is the first time when that belief was at least personally, proven not to be true. I don't think it was smugness. I think it was a question of an act of faith that for some of us was just betrayed.
Okay, but Hannah, I want to focus in on this issue of sanctimonious smugness, particularly as it's practiced by progressive people. How much of that do you think was at play in this election campaign?
I think it was a really big part of the election. I think voters felt that they were being talked at and talked down to, as opposed to having actual conversations. And I think that smugness grew out of that and has been festering for quite a while, so that that was all that people could hear when they were having these conversations.
Janice Stein, you know how much I love you. You know how much I adore you. I'm saying that as a setup because you know it's coming.
I know it's coming.
Because
yes.
you're Exhibit A of what half of the people in America who voted for Donald Trump would find really objectionable. You are kind of like a small L liberal university pointy head, right?
Kind of like, and I drink cappuccinos.
There you go.
There you go.
So how much do we have you to blame for what's happened down
I
there?
actually think we bear a considerable share of the responsibility. For me, the really awful moment in the campaign, and there were many, many awful moments in terms of what Donald Trump said, but a really awful moment came when Hillary Clinton said 50% of the people who support Donald Trump are the deplorables. So she knew she made a mistake, but she made a fundamental mistake. She no longer talked about people's behavior or their attitudes. She just said the people were deplorable. Well, when you say that, it's actually game over. And it's game over in terms of those people who will not support you, but it's game over actually for a liberal. Because there's a deep contradiction. If you're a liberal, you actually don't talk that way. You can disagree with people with respect to their views. Where do we have any evidence that this stuff matters? See, we actually have a case. The Brexit debate, not in the U.S. election, where it's very cloudy and very messy as to what caused what here, but in the Brexit debate, in the last 36 hours, Prime Minister Cameron came out and said, how could all these people make such an ignorant, uninformed, stupid decision? And the polls moved. So if we actually look for a comment that was smug, superior, condescending, that shifted the vote on a crucial decision, that one did.
On the other hand, Stephen, I heard Donald Trump say the same kind of thing when he didn't win Iowa, which was, can the people be so stupid as to not choose me?
I think there's a certain kind of condescension that has sort of drifted over this whole campaign, which is we're treating people who voted for Trump like they didn't know what they were voting for. And I think we have to actually face the fact that they're responsible adults and they made a decision to choose someone who has a program of ethnic cleansing. And that's what we all don't want to face. We all don't want to face that actually a huge number of Americans want somebody who is preparing, as we speak, to destroy 3 million families of vulnerable Mexican immigrants. So I swear to God, I hope they didn't do it because of Janice Stein's tone of voice. I mean, if they decided to do ethnic cleansing because they don't like Janice Stein's tone, that is really disgraceful. That's more disgraceful than them doing it because they believe in it.
I think I know what you're referring to, but you want to just tell me what you mean when you say ethnic cleansing?
Well, they're about to deport a huge number of people based on their race.
They're about to That's not correct.
It is on his website that he's going to set up a Muslim database. So very, very serious decisions based on race are being made right now by and you know all these activities like it's the white working class in America. When you look at the numbers, it's actually country club Republicans. It's actually people in the middle class. It's some of the luckiest people on earth who made this decision.
Hold on, I want to get these two guys in before you get a second kick at it. So Quem, your view on this topic?
My view is I was in the UK during Brexit. And the interesting thing for me is it was clear that people were frustrated. They were frustrated with the intellectuals. They were frustrated with politics. And what did we do? What did people do? We gave them more intellectuals and more politics and just said, well, you know, you're wrong. You know, this is a bit silly and it's going to be terrible. And we don't trust you. We don't believe in you. We don't believe you can do it yourself. And people react to that. Yeah. And I think that when I was seeing what was happening in America, we were having the same sort of thing, where there are a large group of people who were unhappy, and they tried to vote Republican, they tried to vote Democrat, and it never made any difference. They still felt like they weren't actually sharing in the wealth of the states. And instead of actually having a serious conversation and saying, what is driving the fact that you're going to vote for Trump, they just got, you know, well, it's silly. You're silly. If we just give you more information, you'll have an aha moment, and somehow you will just see that we're right all along.
That sounds pretty smug, though, doesn't it? And
I think that they were smug. I think that, and also I think that Hillary and others in their smugness didn't do the work to actually win the election in the way they could do. And it was a totally winnable election.
Mark Toohey, I've left you. No, hang on. I got to get to Mark first. He hasn't said a word yet. Mark, I've left you to the end because I'm guessing you're probably the only guest on the program tonight who would have voted for Trump had you had a vote.
I might have.
Yeah. Okay, in which case you can look at this from a bit of a different perspective than everybody else. Was progressive sanctimony part of the reason why he won?
It's part of the reason. It's not the only reason. I mean, I think the smugness, if you call it that, continues. In most of us, include myself when I say that, don't even realize we're being smug. I agree with Stephen. And when John spoke just a moment ago, talked about, he expected the voters to do the right thing. I would argue the voters did the right thing. Voters went to the polling booths and they cast a ballot for the candidate that they thought would be best for the country that they live in. What I think that those of us who have the luxury of appearing on talk show panels and reading more than one newspaper, reading a newspaper period, often forget is that a whole large swath of our population, both in Canada and the United States, don't have that luxury. They're living hand to mouth, and their life has not gotten any better, and for many of them it's gotten worse over the last 25 years. So I think that most of the people who voted for Donald Trump, they're not racists, they're not misogynists, they're not supporting ethnic cleansing, they're not supporting any of these things.
Although they winked at it during the campaign.
They're supporting it
No, they're
even if
not.
they don't believe
Well,
it.
not
No,
winked.
well, that's not what drove them to the polls. What drove them to the polls was the fact that for 25 years, their quality of life has gone down. They have no hope whatsoever that their children will live to the extent that they have lived. Their lifespans have been shortened statistically. That's what drove them to the polls. And frankly, it wasn't a vote for the Republicans, I think, as much as we might point to traditional Republicans who voted for Trump. This was a vote against I'll call it the establishment, but that's kind of a trite phrase. This was a vote against politics as usual. Whether they voted Democrat or Republican in the past, it hasn't helped them. And then you see a bunch of guys like us talking heads on television, talking in theories and the economic and the GDP. What about my life? What about my job? What about my family? And Donald Trump, as horribly bad a candidate as he was really the only one who was talking to them.
Janice.
Yeah, so just again, Stephen, because the facts matter, and that's one of the things that we've had a lot of trouble with. Obama has deported Mexicans and illegal, undocumented immigrants who have criminal records.
Right.
Yeah. Okay? That's exactly what Trump said in his press conference he would now do. You can't, after the election, that's what he said. I will deport illegal immigrants, undocumented immigrants who have criminal records. There's not a shade of policy difference right now between what they are both saying, and yet we would not say Obama voters supported ethnic cleansing. Right. So, okay, so I think it's
This might be a question of tone, though. It looked like Donald Trump, was licking his chops at the chance to do it.
Okay, but again, that's part of being being very careful, and I think this is where we all come to grief. Being very careful about what we attribute to the motives of people who disagree with our preferred candidate. That's what's caused so much grief, frankly.
Let me get John Ibbitson in on this. John, the last things you did say in your first answer were, I've always trusted people to do, quote unquote, the right thing, and this time they kind of let you down. As the words left your mouth, now having heard what Mark Toohey had to say, you want to take him back?
No, but I remain profoundly conflicted. And if you're not profoundly conflicted in all of this, then maybe you should ask yourself a couple of things. I completely understand and agree with the voter who feels dispossessed, the miner who's lost a job in the coal mine because somebody said acid rain is a problem, the people who think that their jobs disappeared and went to China. They didn't. They disappeared and went to automated assembly lines, but that's not the point. That's what they think happens. I get all of that. And I get as well that Donald Trump moves all over the map depending on the time of the day, but let's not kid ourselves here. Let's not forget what that man said during the course of the election campaign. I'm going to build a wall and make Mexico pay for it. I'm going to keep all Muslims everywhere from around the world from ever entering this country. I'm going to deport all the illegals out of this country, and I don't care if it's legal or not legal. In fact, I don't care if it's legal or not legal to torture. And I'm going to rip up the agreement with Iran, and I'm going to rip up NAFTA, and I'm going to impose tariffs on China, which would create a global trade war and a global recession. He said all those things. And I understand that people just push right past that and say, he's the only guy who hears my voice. He's the only guy who speaks for me. Nonetheless, these are the things this man has said, and we have to face that.
Hannah, in terms of where on the political spectrum smugness likes to live, we're seeing right now lots of examples of smug people on the left who, woke up Wednesday morning thinking that their world as they knew it had ended. Is it a unique feature of the left?
I think recently it really has become the left's defining feature. I think historically we can probably see examples of smugness being a Republican or a conservative trait as well. I live in Denmark sometimes, and we definitely have smugness across the political spectrum there. But right now I feel like the left has just become so out of touch and so internalized in the news that they're reading and the conversations that they're having, that this smugness has really centered on what's defining the left.
See, I don't agree at all. I think we're equal opportunity smug. And I certainly know many, many people on the right who speak with dripping condescension about soft, mushy liberals who don't know what they think and don't know where they stand and are utterly disdainful and contemptuous and there's always the big L left, right? So I think I think we have an issue here.
Most of them work at Fox TV, I think.
A lot of them are on Fox TV, but a lot of them are elsewhere too. It's not only in one place. And so I think it's both on the left and on the right. There's the same tendency to be utterly dismissive in personal terms of people who disagree with you. Now, if you think about you can disagree with somebody's policy position, but that doesn't equate to being a racist or being a misogynist, frankly. It may, but it doesn't necessarily. And where we're making a terrible mistake if we're thinking about a pluralist, liberal democracy, because that is what I believe in, is when we attribute the most base motives to people with whom we profoundly disagree on policy.
Let me pick up on that.
Bannon is the White House chief of staff.
Yes.
The idea that we're...
Reince is.
No, he's not.
Priebus is, sorry, he's
the senior advisor.
He's the senior advisor.
Strategic
Sorry,
advisor.
pardon me, strategic
Whatever that
advisor.
happens
So
to
the
be.
idea that we're dealing with two competing models within the pluralist liberal democracy is actually old-fashioned. I mean, even the phrase smugness, like what we're dealing with this election is Facebook. This is what we're all dealing with. We're all in a bubble. We are all in our own bubbles, and all we can see are the other people's bubbles, right? We are. I mean, 40% of people who voted for Hillary. I mean, it was some huge number. It was believed that she was actually a demon. Who voted against Hillary believed that she was actually a demon.
What do you think people who voted against Donald Trump believe? That he's a demon.
Well, exactly. That's right. I mean, that's where we're at now.
Can I pick up on that?
Where the demonization has just gone. It's just gone absolutely mainstream.
I want to pick up on that with Quem because obviously you're a guy who understands brains here better than you are professionally trained to understand what goes on in the brain. What is a better? We completely seem to have lost the ability to debate rationally with one another. I shouldn't say we. Certainly they down there, based on the campaign that's just taken place. What's a better strategy for interacting with your political opponents rather than just calling them every foul, gross name in the book?
Well, I think one of the problems that we've had in the election down south is they actually never had a policy discussion I can remember. We saw these debates which were extraordinary in their lack of depth. And part of the reason was that there didn't seem to be any interest in trying to understand the other person's point of view. So because there was just name calling from one side to the other, but there was nobody who said, okay, right, you believe this. Why do you believe this? Perhaps we can work out what we actually really believe together and how we can move forward as a country. And I can understand that when you're doing politics through the media or Facebook, or you've got people who just stay in their own communities, that people might not want to do that. But that's what you have to do if you want unity. You do actually have to understand somebody else. And I don't think people did. It's a bit like if any of you have had a teenager and the teenager's upset and they're making no sense at all. What you can do is you can go in and you can laugh at them. That works well. Or you can just go and you can just talk at them and tell them things and tell them to pull themselves together or do this or that. That doesn't work very well. Or you can just tell them to come and do what you want them to do. And that doesn't work very well. You do actually have to engage with the emotion and you have to understand and engage with the frustration. And nobody did that.
That's not the purpose of a debate.
No. A debate is a stylized
a debate-
ritual
I
in
completely
politics.
understand. But it's not just the debate. The whole of the campaign worked that way.
That's always been the way the campaigns.
Has
What's
it?
changed is the
Different, though.
technology.
Let me
But
tell you
that's
what's
an
different
interesting
here.
thing because when you look at some of the work that Putnam did, the political theorist, he said that's actually something that has increased since the 60s.
So you
he
know
said
what the
before the
catchphrase
60s,
is?
yeah.
And that's new, and we didn't have this in our politics before. And we've had it in this city, by the way, too. When we don't like the outcome of an election, what do we say to each other on both sides, the right and the left? And I've heard it in both communities.
rigged.
No, it's worse. That's not us. That's not who we are. I heard that all over this city. So anybody, we'll come to that later, but anybody who thinks we don't do it is not correct. When you think about that, that's not us. That means those people are excluded. We're excluding them from the conversation because they're not us, they're not like us, they don't think like us. We don't want them in the broader conversation.
Mark.
Politics is theater. And as important as the players on the stage are the players behind the stage. And that may be where we've gone awry because the candidates are actors and they're out there to play their roles and to say repeat their lines and to deliver their message. And they need to be wholeheartedly engaged in that like professional wrestlers. It's a show. But when the lights go down and the audience leaves, the wrestlers go back and they share a dressing room in the small venues that they're at, and they share a lunch, and they move on to the next town. That's starting to be lost. The backroom stuff.
Yeah.
Even with Rob Ford. Rob Ford had a message to deliver. He had a way to deliver it. He stayed on message, much more disciplined than Donald Trump. But behind the stage, there were people who also understood that the reason why George Smitherman is saying that is this. Right? And part of that is political theatrics, and part of that is political tactics, and part of that is because people believe that, and there's an element of truth in some of this that doesn't conflict with what we're saying. So don't go here, because we all need to occupy this space later. And I think the backroom sides maybe really failed the United States electorate in this.
John Ibbitson, I want to pick up on a comment Janice made earlier about the so-called basket of deplorables. And go back to that clip we saw off the top of our discussion today from The Daily Show, where there was a person wearing a shirt with a couple of disgusting slogans on them. I'm not even going to repeat them. But they did not see the irony of saying, "We in America respect women," and then the slogans on that T-shirt, which showed anything but respect for a couple of women in particular. Why shouldn't people like that be made fun of?
Well, look, again, this is the contradiction, and I'm sorry that I sound like a broken record here, but there are disgusting, awful, horrible, racist, xenophobic, misogynist, crummy, even evil people at Trump rallies and supporting Donald Trump. And the fact that one of the failings in journalism was that so many reporters went to the rallies, interviewed those people, and said, this is the Trump coalition. Well, of course, it's not the Trump coalition. It's all those voters in Wisconsin that Hillary Clinton didn't even notice. She never even bothered to set foot in the state, who then gave the election to Donald Trump by voting for him. It's a whole range of issues, and it's difficult and complicated to separate out the extremists, the truly hate-driven types, from those who are simply confused and angry and upset and disenfranchised. But again, we have to go back to the reality of it. As you've already pointed out, Steve Bannon is in the White House, and there are a rash of racist acts that have taken place across the United States and here in Canada, even this morning here in Ottawa, that I don't believe are simply coincidental as a result of this man becoming president-elect.
Tell us about the Ottawa one.
A rabbi woke up this morning to find on her door a swastika and the word kike. And I tweeted the CBC report on this and said, this is what Mr. Trump has bequeathed us. And my feed is filled with people who are saying there's no connection whatsoever between the election of Donald Trump and what some stupid kid does on somebody's door in Ottawa. You don't think so?
There might
What
be.
people say does matter. And this is one of the reasons why I agree with what people say about, at the moment, politics is theatre. Shame, but it seems like it is. But it's not always been that way, and there has been more consensus politics in the past. But it is important what you say. It does change what people do, and people do feel that they've got license to do things if they have, one of the most powerful men in the world who says things that are racist.
I don't take away from that, but there was swastika graffiti spray painted on people's doors and headstones before Trump became president-elect, and there will be after he is. How can you make the direct connection?
No, I think you're right. There has been and there will be. The question is, will there be more? And I believe there will be more.
I want to jump in just briefly.
And then Janice, yes.
Okay.
If we go back to that Daily Show clip with the guy with the crazy T-shirt, part of the problem, I think, when we call people deplorable, we're generalizing. I can make anybody look stupid, any one of us, on television. That's easy to do. The guy clearly didn't understand the joke. But I also say, perhaps in his defense, perhaps not, maybe he is a racist, maybe he's a down-in-the-wool, dyed-in-the-wool misogynist, but maybe he just really doesn't like Hillary Clinton and the Clintons. And he's protesting that. And the fact that the person that you dislike and are therefore vocally protesting, even if it's obscene what you're saying about them, doesn't necessarily mean you hate all women. Doesn't necessarily mean you hate all Jews.
But you know what?
It's easy for us to say that and tar everybody else who then step back and say, well, I'm not that person.
I get you, but you're not a Hillary Clinton fan, and you wouldn't wear that T-shirt in public. I know you well enough to know you wouldn't.
I don't wear many T-shirts like that. I find it hard to understand how people hate people. I really do. Like I can get incredibly angry with counselors on the floor of council or politicians for their policies, but that doesn't mean they're bad people. It means we disagree viscerally, but they're still human beings, and we can relate like that. But I think we've tarred far too many people far too quickly with labels like racist and misogynist and homophobic.
Janice and
So,
Stephen.
one of the other interesting moments during the campaign, and here I agree, with John, there were absolutely horrific things said during this campaign, and that's what debased the campaign, and that's what led to, I think, a universal disgust, frankly, with the state of politics. There was one of the interesting moments that we haven't talked about enough was when two very well-known older feminists came out and said to women, if you don't support Hillary Clinton, you're not us.
Gloria Steinem said that.
Gloria Steinem.
Was that a mistake?
Yeah, and one others. Yes, of course it's a mistake. Because what does that really say? It says, line up with us and rule out the possibility that you might have difficulty with Hillary Clinton on any number of issues, right? Just forget about all that. Either you play my game of identity politics or you're out. Now, tell me how that's a respectful comment about women who are supposed to have an independent mind, think it through, and vote for the candidate whose policies they support. That's the problem that we're not talking about. That's smug.
I just think the idea that the problem with the left was that we weren't polite enough, and we weren't, and that liberals were disrespectful. I mean, did you hear the opponent?
Yes.
I mean, also, I think we should state here clearly, like, Steve Bannon is not some guy at a rally. He's now in the White House. Yeah, he is a noted anti-Semite.
But
they are planning on setting up a religious database that is on their website today.
See, you're doing it again.
So this thing, well, no, because these are policy. This is actually, if you
but you're doing it again. You're focusing on Steve Bannon as if that's the issue. The issue that you should be focusing on is not the candidate. It's not Steve Bannon. It's why did millions of Americans vote for him?
Okay.
And why wouldn't the left or anybody of a reasonable, rational mind try to understand what their concerns were and then build a policy or a platform that would address those valid concerns?
I'm just going to say something here. There are people alive today who lived through the Great Depression, and it was horrible. And the way they responded to it was by fighting fascism, not by giving into it. And the idea that just because, and also the whole idea that the white working class was in some terrible state, and then this justifies this racism, this like ferocious racism that, I mean, you can say that it's not racism, but he said it repeatedly. said it to Cheers, and the person that he's put in power is a racist. So I don't know
Let's
what.
get Quam.
What was racist?
Quam?
I think that we're talking about different things. So if we're talking about why the election was won or lost, we're talking about actually a relatively small percentage of people, one way or another, who swing one way or another. My argument is that they could have probably been persuaded if there had been a different type of engagement with them and if we really understood them. And it is true that people compare themselves to each other. And over the last 20, 25 years in the United States, their gross domestic product has gone up and up and up. People have got richer in general, but a whole bunch of people have been left behind. And the people who've been left behind, people with $50,000 and above, who feel like everybody else has got away from them, they started voting for Trump.
50,000 and below.
No,
and above.
50,000 and
above.
That's
People
the
who
thing.
were
It's
really
not
poor,
actually
people
poor
who
are
were
not
really
voting.
poor voted Clinton. People who were 50,000
Actually,
and
I got it
above,
here.
but
Let-
living
that's right.
in rural areas, they voted Trump.
Let's put these up. Hang on one sec, everybody. Han, I'll get you to comment on these first, but somebody referred to the Trump coalition. Here it is. Just look at the monitors here in the studio. These are the exit polls, and we discovered that whites made up 58% of Trump's coalition, blacks 8%. Now, you'll say that's a small number, but it's better than the previous two Republican nominees for president, as is the Hispanic/Latino percentage that voted for Trump, 29%, which again is much higher than voted for Mitt Romney or John McCain. Flip over to the next slide. In terms of age, once again, 18 to 29, they came out huge for Obama in the past two elections. Not so much for Hillary Clinton this time. And as you go down the age demographic breakdowns right there, you'll see how competitive the race was. These are areas, where obviously Barack Obama did much better. Let's do one more, and that is on the issue of your expectations for the next generation of Americans, something Mark was referring to. Look at this. For those who think that their kids are going to do worse, Donald Trump got 2 out of 3 votes. That was very key. And Hannah, how did the beautiful people all miss the fact that such a wide swath of the U.S. population was going to be for Trump?
Well, I think it's this echo chamber that we keep talking about, where we're not listening, we're not talking to other people outside of our group, so we don't really realize what's going to happen. But I think we have to be careful with the Trump voters and the basket of deplorable statement was a terrible, ridiculous thing to say. But I think what she was trying to say was there are some Trump supporters that are voting for him because they like his racist, homophobic, his misogynistic statements. And we're not going to get to them. But if we look at what the other reasons are for people to vote Trump, we can start to talk about those. And I don't think it could have been done in this election. I think it's a rebuilding of the Democratic Party and the Republican Party too, for a large extent, to start to do these conversations and actually listen to what people are saying and identify what the real problems are. Because looking at those graphs, the real problems are things like, I don't want to deal with climate change. My life right now is terrible and my children's lives are terrible. And even if they really aren't terrible, we think they are, we perceive them, and we have to deal with people's perceptions.
Mark.
I think part of why people missed it is because they were looking at the sexy, terrifying, high volume or high loudness, low quantity issues. There are racists, there are misogynists, there are all of these people, and a lot of them supported Trump. But as Quan said, the amount of people that swung the vote was small. And they weren't the racists. They weren't the misogynists, because they weren't going to Hillary before. If they were voting for anybody, they were always with Trump. So this election was not won or lost by racists. This election was won or lost by Americans and their personal issues and how they see the future and which candidate they thought might do something that would make it a little bit better for their family. Yeah, they're a racist, but they're a fringe element, and I understand the concerns with Steve Bannon, but I also don't know what it means, having worked in a political office, to be a senior advisor to anybody. It's a job that can be as big or as completely non-existent as the president chooses to make it. And that's, I think, what will tell the tale, to see how much influence he has.
You know, just to hone in on this argument, if 2 states in the Midwest had voted differently, we would have President-elect Clinton. So if Wisconsin and Pennsylvania had voted differently.
Hotbeds of racism.
Yeah, now it's really difficult. So, and actually it's very interesting that her husband, who's got much better political instincts, she's a really strong policy person, he has much better political instincts, asked her campaign to get out of the cities in Wisconsin and Pennsylvania and Michigan.
Go get that suburban,
And go out
exurban,
to the suburbs
Catholic
and-
white vote,
right.
and they didn't do it.
And no, they told him he didn't know what he was talking about and he was wrong. Well, he wasn't wrong. If you actually think about, and they invested no time in Wisconsin. She never went to Wisconsin.
After the convention.
That's right, after the convention. So what's the and even that last rally, which made me cringe, was in Philadelphia, and it was Hello Philadelphia. This was somebody, a campaign, made a deliberate decision to talk to the cities, to talk to largely city dwellers, to talk to women, which is a very important thing to do from my perspective, to talk to minorities, and thought that the Obama coalition would hold, and she could just pay no attention whatsoever to this group of people who thought their children's future was going to be one of downward mobility. She wears this, and the campaign wears this. That's the important point if we want to look ahead and think about the future.
But what we've now got, and the thing that is scary, is it was a winnable election. Maybe they didn't do the work that they should have done. But now we have a situation where actually you could be quite worried about who one sees coming.
I am very worried.
Coming
I'm
into
very worried.
to
But I'm
the
very
cabinet.
angry also, in all honesty. I'm both very worried about the future, but I'm very angry because this was a winnable election.
Totally winnable.
And
Well, she got more votes. Let's remember that.
That's
She did
right.
get more votes.
But there was more work to be done than that. You know, Steve,
Yeah,
you
sure.
have to pay attention to the Electoral College. That's what decides U.S. elections. So I'm very angry at the people who didn't pay attention to voices that weren't natural fits with their own coalition.
Let me try this with John Ibbitson. Peter Thiel was one of those guys who spoke at the Republican convention last summer. He's a Silicon Valley billionaire, now member of Trump's transition team. And he said the media, quote, never takes Trump seriously, but it always takes him literally. I think a lot of voters who vote for Trump take Trump seriously, but not literally. That is a fascinating insight, I think, and I wonder, John, if that's the new normal in politics now.
I thought it was a very smart insight from a guy I don't like very much. Mr. Thiel also single-handedly managed to bring down Gawker just because he didn't like the fact that they outed him. But I think there is nonetheless great wisdom in the idea. And again, those who aren't racist, who aren't misogynist, who aren't terrified of the other, but who are just terrified about their children's education. As I said in one piece, what do you do if your daughter's getting a C? She's only getting a C. What's going to happen to her? These people, made those votes wisely and intelligently in their mind, and not out of anger and not out of hate. But what worries me as well, since we're talking about Silicon Valley, is my Facebook feed. My Facebook feed has become completely useless. It is filled with articles from the New York Times and the Washington Post and Atlantic Magazine and Vox. And of course I read all of these people. But I also want to read people on the other side of the argument. I'm a journalist. What I do mostly is listen to people on the other side of the argument so I can find out what it is they're saying. I cannot for the life of me convince Facebook to tweak its algorithm to send me things I don't agree with so that I can read those people. If that's happening to all of us, and I suspect it is, how do we bridge these two solitudes?
That is a great go. Stephen, we're all in our echo chambers now.
Recently, for Esquire, I was writing this piece, and I talked about the American breakdown before the election, and I was talking to all these neo-Nazis, right? So I was talking to all these white nationalists, not American nationalists, white nationalists, very important distinction. And these guys are absolutely civil. You can absolutely have a great conversation with them. They are, they all have graduate degrees. Some of them have law degrees from top schools. They just really hate black people. And if you ask them that, they'll tell you that. So I'm not sure we're at the point where it's about tone. It's about conversation. I think we're actually at the point where we're at facts, where we're at what did the people politically want. And everyone here is acting maybe because we have to, like Trump is actually not going to do what he said he was going to do. But I see no evidence that he is not going to do exactly what he said he was going to do. And if he does a half of what he said he was going to do, it is the end of the international liberal order. I mean, just to be perfectly clear about what the stakes are here. So, you know, I would love to believe that, yeah, there's the pivot's coming. I don't know why on earth he would pivot when not pivoting has just made him the most powerful man on earth.
Quam.
No, I agree. I think that on some levels you've got to take people at their word. And if you believe those words, then we should be quite worried. Where I think...
Yeah, but Peter Thiel said, don't take him at his word.
Well, there are two different things. I mean, I think that there...
Peter Thiel says, don't take him literally. Take him seriously, don't take him literally.
I think there are two different things. I think one of the things is this personality politics. And so people were voting for him as a personality as much as a politician, because his policies, like, they were pretty thin.
He's on both sides of every issue.
Yeah, exactly. They're pretty thin. And Clinton actually was putting herself forward as a policy person, but people were voting, and so people would look at her and they'd say whether they agree or not with her policies. And with him, there's whether they agree or not with Donald Trump. And the same thing happened, by the way, in the UK and Brexit. And people like Boris Johnson were Teflon because it was the personality, not the politics. So if you then make a policy attack, it doesn't necessarily work.
See, but if you actually follow on from that, and I do take Donald Trump very seriously, very.
Literally? Or seriously?
Very seriously, and at times literally.
So you think he's going to deport 12 million people?
No, I do not.
Well, then you're not taking him literally.
Well, he's already said he's not. He's already said he's not doing that. He's only going to deport people who have criminal records who are undocumented. And as I said, I don't even support that, but Obama did it, and nobody called Obama a racist when he did it. So to level the playing field here. But to come back, I take him very seriously. I'm very worried about what the future brings. But if in fact there's defense against some of the worst excesses that might occur under a Trump presidency, it's about broadening the coalition. It's about reaching out to people who are outside it currently, who think differently, and finding a way to talk to people where they feel genuinely respected and genuinely included despite differences in policy. That's not going to happen if we sit here and stereotype everybody who voted for Donald Trump as a racist, misogynist, and there are other things we can call them.
I want to bring Mark Toohey in on this point here, and we'll bring up a graphic which you can read here in the studio. I'm on page 6 here. This is Kelly Leach, who's running for leader of the Conservative Party right now, who wrote, "Tonight, our American cousins threw out the elites and elected Donald Trump as their next president. It's an exciting message, and one that we need delivered in Canada as well. It's the message I'm bringing with my campaign to be the next Prime Minister of Canada." To which Andrew McGrath tweeted, "Got this from my old boss. I'm so disappointed in you, Kelly Leach. You were status of women minister. Shame on you." Mark, I don't know if you're still a card-carrying Conservative. I think you were once upon a time, or you're certainly...
I am whatever I'm getting paid to be.
Okay. You have worked for the candidates on that side of the political spectrum. We are already starting to see the impact of the Trump victory on Canadian politics. Kelly Leach thinks this is a wave worth riding. Is she right?
She did before Trump. She started her campaign, just for the record, before Trump.
She did, and she started it with the values survey question.
Immigration values. Yeah.
I think this is segmentation politics at play here. I'm not sure that it has anything to do with what she believes. I think she wants to be the leader of the Conservative Party. I think she is nowhere near likely to win it, and so she needs to increase her profile. So she's accomplishing that. I think that most Conservatives are not like the people at this table, save me, who aren't afraid of a Trump presidency because they don't believe it's going to be the apocalypse. So I think that puts her on the right side of them in a media storm that's saying this is the end of the earth. So that, I think, just makes sense from a segmentation perspective. And I think the anti-elite message only really works in Ontario, because in Ontario, that's the message that the provincial Conservatives might use against the Liberal government that's been in power for some time. The federal Conservatives were in power until a year and a bit ago. So, I mean, I'm not sure that it works there. But this is the vote-rich area. It's a one-member, one-vote system for the Conservative Party. It's all about signing up membership. So I think this is pure tactics. The question, though, that I've had for her is, you have to, again, this is the difference between the front of the stage and behind the stage. You can't paint yourself into a corner, because how do you get out of that corner once you've painted it?
Hannah, can I get your take on this and the impact of Trumpism on Canadian affairs?
So we're in southwestern Ontario, and the anti-elite message actually resonates quite a bit, I think. I think it's a lot like how every Canadian thinks they're middle class. Every Canadian doesn't think they're elite. So attacking the elite is really not attacking anyone who votes and anyone who they know. So it's an interesting message. It could work in Ontario just simply because there are big portions of the province that feel like they're not being listened to by the elites, whoever they might be. So that could be an appealing approach for Kelly.
John, I've already been asked, do you think the Trump phenomenon could come to Canada? And my answer was, it already has. His name was Rob Ford. Is that an appropriate analogy?
No, because Rob Ford was broadly supported by immigrant voters. And that's the case here too. But 3 very quick points. First off, it's not actually one member, one vote for this party. It's one member, one vote within 338 ridings, each riding equally weighted. So yeah, there are a lot of rural ridings in Atlantic Canada, in Quebec outside Montreal, in central Ontario, in parts of the prairies, in the interior of BC, where an anti-elite message, even a nativist message, quite honestly, might resonate, might do well. But I don't think it would win her the nomination unless unless the same thing happens that happens in the States, which is that all the anti-Leach folk fragments. You're going to need to find the candidate who can most likely defeat Kelly Leach, whether it's Erin O'Toole or Lisa Raitt or Michael Chong or Andrew Scheer, whoever it is, and consolidate that vote. Whether that person, whether Kelly Leach could win the election, I can tell you that right now for sure. As certainly as I said, Hillary Clinton was a shoo-in, which is that no, you can't win an election in Canada unless you win the 905. Every election since 1968, with one exception, has been won by the 905. Those ridings are heavily, even majority immigrant voters, and you do not win the 905 with Kelly Leach's message. Period. Full stop.
Janice.
Yeah, I agree with John. I understand the strategy. She's going to distinguish herself from the pack. She's raised more money than any other candidate, which is alarming, this deep into the campaign. But I do not think it's a winning strategy for the party. In fact, the hinge moment in our last election campaign was when she came out and said, we are going to establish a snitch line for barbaric cultural practices. And that was the decisive moment when the vote turned against the Harper government. It was still in play, and that's what that was the death knell for them. So why she thinks that doing it again will work, except in the narrowest sense that she's positioning herself within the party. Does that mean that I do not think that I don't take her campaign seriously? That I do not think it's damaging to have this kind of discussion in that way? That it is not frightening to some of our immigrant communities in this country? I do. And I think those people, it's incumbent on those in office and those outside of office to reach out, to have these inclusive conversations with people, to reach beyond our Facebook friends and the people that we normally talk to and say, what an awful thing to do and what an awful thing to say. Actually get out into those communities and engage, which is, again, what the Clinton campaign utterly failed to do.
Yeah.
And we're all paying the price, and it's a very large price. We're all paying it for that mistake, for only talking to people that think like us, eat like us, live like us.
If you're going to do that strategy, pick the biggest group.
Well, that's
70% of voters in the United States are white. 50% of those are male.
But that
and Hillary
doesn't
Clinton
work.
offered nothing for them.
But that doesn't work for a democracy that's supposed to be liberal, inclusive, and respectful of minorities.
This liberal democracy or this liberal leader, Hillary Clinton, completely ignored 70% of the people. So that's not inclusion either.
Doesn't it feel like we're doing it all again? We're all sitting around saying, no, that can't work. That's never going to happen. She can never win.
No, John was being facetious when he said that.
I know.
Yeah, he sure was.
And because, yeah, she could actually. And, and people sometimes think of the immigrant vote as being like, all immigrants are the same.
They're not.
And they're not.
They're not.
They are not. And you have to be careful with that.
The thing that brought the immigrant vote out for Rob Ford was the very last debate in 2010 when he was ambushed by a question about, I think it was Tamils, a boatload of Tamils coming, and what he would do to welcome them to the city of Toronto. And his answer was, I don't want them here. We don't have room for them. We've got to worry about the people who are here. And I thought that was a mistake. I thought that was perhaps the end of it. And certainly the opposition thought that was the end of him. The next morning I walked into the campaign office and there was a line of immigrants out the door with checks in their hand because they believed that too. So we can't assume that the 905 votes as a homogenous bloc. It doesn't.
But also, conservatism in Canada has not necessarily been. I mean, Rob Ford had many vices, but racism was not one of them. I don't think his worst enemy really ever. I mean, other than a few like distractions, but like no one really believed that. And when you look at the Conservative Party of Canada, like other than the incredible mistake at the end of the last election, which was a disaster. Like I remember seeing Jason Kenney. He was in Jack Layton's Riding. He was at a book launch for a Sri Lankan writer, and he was out pressing every palm he could. Like in the middle of it, he had no chance, and it was right after an election too. Like it was just like, and he had 5 events to go to like that.
But you see,
wasn't that make-up time? I mean, they'd actually stopped giving proper health benefits to refugees. Got rid of the long-form census.
But no, that was before that happened, and there was that turn, and it was a real disaster for them. I just don't think Canadian conservatism can at all be motivated
but if you
the
look
way
at
Americans
Jason
can.
Kenney, that's a really interesting example of what I'm talking about. A social conservative, no question about it, but deliberate strategy for looked at the map, said we will never win government in this country if we don't make room inside the Conservative Party for a rainbow inside the party, and spent 3 years of his life going to every breakfast and every lunch in every immigrant community, understood they're not homogeneous, is incredibly knowledgeable, and these are real people to him. That's very different from somebody who will come out, even in the heat of an election campaign, and say, we're going to have a snitch line for barbaric cultural practices. That's somebody who actually has never spent time in those communities. This is the health of the
country. It's actually not with liberals and pointy heads like us. It's actually with the heart of the Conservative Party and whether which of these paths they choose.
I don't agree with that one either.
Let me jump in here. We got a minute left here, and I do want to go to. I want to go to Mark on this issue. I tried. Ibbenson didn't like my premise that we've already had Trumpism here. It was Rob Ford. Do you not see a lot of similarities between Rob Ford and Donald Trump?
Yeah, I do, and I frankly don't buy that appealing to racists is what won Donald Trump the election. So if we take that, whether I'm right or wrong, understand the baseline that I'm coming from. I think what I saw Donald Trump do, which Rob Ford did, was actually listen to real people and hear what they were saying their concerns were, and then champion those on the political stage. Now, the difference is Rob Ford had 10 years as a counselor to get to know all those people and build relationships. On the other hand, Donald Trump, he's never had that experience, but he had a reality TV show, and he's built this sort of one-way mirror, sort of vicarious relationship with lots of Americans.
I'll give John 30 seconds to respond. Equal time if you like, John.
Only that because I've written about it so much, the Conservative Party of Canada was the only Conservative Party in the developed world that had the support of immigrant voters, recognizing that they are culturally and economically more conservative than native-born on many issues. And they only threw that away at the very end in an act of suicidal desperation, and that's what Kelly Leitch is trying to recreate, and that's why she will fail.
Since all of your other predictions have turned out to be so spot on, John,
we keep inviting me. What am I supposed to do?
But we all got it
we
wrong.
just may
we all got it
speak
wrong.
for yourself. That's it for our time tonight. I want to thank everybody for coming from near and far to participate in the discussion. There's Hannah Rasmussen from Projection North in London, Ontario. John Ibbitson, one of our favorite writers for the Globe and Mail. Thanks you two for being there out of town. Quam McKenzie from CAMH. Stephen Marsh, you can read him in Esquire magazine. Janice Stein, founding director of the Munk School of Global Affairs at U of T. Mark Toohey, the author of Mayor Rob Ford, Uncontrollable. Thanks so much, everybody.
Thanks, Steve.
Help TVO create a better world through the power of learning. Visit TVO.org and make a tax-deductible donation today.